Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to discuss 19th century imperialism. So the 19th century certainly didn't invent the empire, but it did take it to new heights, by which we mean lows. Or possibly heights. I don't know, I can't decide. Roll the intro while I think of it. Europeans had been involved in Africa since the 16th century when the Portuguese used their cannons to take control of cities on coast to set up their trading post empire. But in the second half of the 19th century, Europe suddenly and spectacularly succeeded at colonizing basically all of Africa. Why? Well, the biggest reason that Europeans were able to extend their grasp over so much of the world was the same reason they wanted to do so in the first place: industrialization. Nationalism played its part, of course. European states saw it as a real bonus to be able to say that they had colonies, so much so that a children's rhyme in an ABC for baby patriots went, "C is for colonies, rightly we boast, that of all the great countries, Great Britain has the most." But it was mostly, not to get all Marxist on you or anything, about controlling the means of production. Europeans wanted colonies to secure sources of raw materials, especially cotton, copper, iron, and rubber, that were used to fuel their growing industrial economies. And in addition to providing the motive for imperialism, European industrialization also provided the means. Europeans didn't fail to take over territory in Africa until the late 19th century because they didn't want to. They failed because they couldn't. This was mostly due to disease. Unlike in the Americas, Africans weren't devastated by diseases like smallpox because they'd had smallpox for centuries and were just as immune to it as Europeans were. Not only that, but Africa had diseases of its own, including yellow fever, malaria, and sleeping sickness, all of which killed Europeans in staggering numbers. Also, Nagana was a disease endemic to Africa that killed horses, which made it difficult for Europeans to take advantage of African grasslands, and also difficult for them to get inland because their horses would die as they tried to carry stuff. Also, while in the 16th century Europeans did have guns, they were pretty useless, especially without horses, so most fighting was done the old-fashioned way, with swords. That worked pretty well in the Americas, unless you were the Incas or the Aztecs, but it didn't work in Africa, because the Africans also had swords, and spears, and axes. So as much as they might have wanted to colonize Africa in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Africa's mosquitoes, microbes, and people were too much for them. So what made the difference? Technology. First, steamships made it possible for Europeans to travel inland, bringing supplies and personnel via Africa's navigable rivers. No horses? No problem. Even more important was quinine medicine, sometimes in the form of tonic water mixed into refreshing, quintessentially British gin and tonics. Quinine isn't as effective as modern anti-malarial medication, and it doesn't cure the disease, but it does help moderate its effects. But of course, the most important technology that enabled Europeans to dominate Africa was guns. By the 19th century, European gun technology had improved dramatically, especially with the introduction of the Maxim machine gun, which allowed Europeans to wipe out Africans in battle after battle. Of course, machine guns were effective when wielded by Africans too, but Africans had fewer of them. Alright, so here is something that often gets overlooked. European imperialism involved a lot of fighting and a lot of dying. And when we say that Europe came to dominate Africa, for the most part, that domination came through wars, which killed lots of Africans and also lots of Europeans, although most of them died from disease. It's very, very important to remember that Africans did not meekly acquiesce to European hegemony. They resisted, often violently, but ultimately they were defeated by a technologically superior enemy. In this respect, they were a lot like the Chinese and also the Indians and the Vietnamese, and you get the picture. So by the end of the 19th century, most of Africa and much of Asia had been colonized by European powers. I mean, even Belgium got in on it, and they weren't even a country at the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, Belgium has enjoyed like 12 years of sovereignty in the last 3 millennia. Notable exceptions include Japan, which was happily pursuing its own imperialism, Thailand, Iran, and of course Afghanistan, because no one can conquer Afghanistan unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols. It's tempting to imagine Europe ruling their colonies with the proverbial topaz fist, and while there was always the threat of violence, the truth is a lot more complicated. Let's go to the thought bubble. In most cases, Europeans ruled their colonies with the help of, and sometimes completely through, intermediaries and collaborators. For example, in the 1890s in India, there were fewer than 1,000 British administrators supposedly ruling over 300 million Indians. The vast majority of British troops at any given time in India, more than 2/3, were in fact Indians under the command of British officers. Because of their small numbers relative to local populations, most European colonizers resorted to indirect rule, relying on the governments that were already there but exerting control over their leaders. Frederick Lugard, who was Britain's head honcho in Nigeria for a time, called this rule through and by the natives. This worked particularly well with British administrators, who were primarily middle-class men but had aristocratic pretensions and were often pleased to associate with the highest echelons of Indian or African society. Now, this isn't to say that indigenous rulers were simply puppets, often they retained real power. This was certainly true in India, where more than a third of the territory was ruled by Indian princes. The French protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia were ruled by Arab monarchs, and the French also ruled through native kings in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. For the most part, Europeans could almost always rely on their superior military technology to coerce local rulers into doing what the Europeans wanted, and they could replace native officials with Europeans if they had to, but in general, they preferred to rule indirectly. It was easier and cheaper. Also less money. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So while we can't know why all native princes who ruled in the context of European imperialism put up with it, we can make some pretty good guesses. First of all, they were still rulers. They got to keep their prestige and their fancy hats, and to some extent their power. Many were also able to gain advantages through their service, like access to European education for themselves and for their children. Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, was the son of an Indian high official, which made it possible for him to study law in England. And we can't overlook the sheer practicality of it. The alternative was to resist, and that usually didn't work out well. I'm reminded of the famous couplet, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." But even with this enormous technological advantage, it wasn't always easy. For example, it took 25 years from 1845 to 1870 for the British to fully defeat the Maori on New Zealand, because the Maori were kick-ass fighters who had mastered musketry and defensive warfare, and I will remind you, it is not cursing if you're talking about donkeys. In fact, it took them being outnumbered 3-1 with the arrival of 750,000 settlers for the Maori to finally capitulate. And I will remind you that the rule against splitting infinitives is not an actual rule. Those of you more familiar with US history might notice a parallel between the Maori and some of the Native American tribes like the Apaches and the Lakota, a good reminder that the United States did some imperial expansion of its own as part of its nationalizing project in the 19th century. But back to Africa, sometimes African rulers were so good at adapting European technology that they were able to successfully resist imperialism. Ethiopia's Menelik II defeated the Italians in battle, securing not just independence, but an empire of his own. But embracing European-style modernization could also be problematic, as Khedive Ismail of Egypt found out during his rule in the late 19th century. He celebrated his imperial success by commissioning an opera, Giuseppe Verdi's Aida, for the opening of the Cairo Opera House in 1871. Giuseppe Verdi, by the way, no relation to John Green. And Ismail had ambitions of extending Egypt's control up the Nile west toward Lake Chad, but to do that he needed money, and that's where he got into trouble. His borrowing bankrupted Egypt and led to Britain's taking control over the country's finances and its shares in the Suez Canal that Ismail had built with French engineers and French capital in 1869. The British sent in 1,300 bureaucrats to fix Egypt's finances, an invasion of red tape that led to a nationalist uprising, which brought on a full-scale British intervention after 1881 in order to protect British interests. This business imperialism, as it is sometimes known, is really at the heart of the imperialistic impulse. Industrialized nations push economic integration upon developing nations and then extract value from those developing nations just as you would from a mine or a field you owned. And here we see political history and economic history coming together again. As Western corporations grew in the latter part of the 19th century, their influence grew as well, both in their home countries and in the lands where they were investing. But ultimately, whether the colonizer is a business enterprise or a political one, the complicated legacy of imperialism survives. It's why your bananas are cheap, why your call centers are Indian, why your chocolate comes from Africa, and why everything else comes from China. These imperialistic adventures may have only lasted a century, but it was the century in which the world as we know it today began to take shape.
All right. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about India, specifically in how it was a target of European imperial control or European colonization in the 19th century. So if you go back in time a little bit, before we get into what the Raj was and the British direct control over the subcontinent, we need to give a little context, a little history about what happened from the last unit, the early modern period, Gunpowder Empire period, where the Mughal dynasty was extremely powerful, and how that evolved into the British getting a foothold in India and taking over control there. So you need to remember that, India was a target of European trade. They had many commodities and commercial products that Europeans were very fond of and wanted to acquire, like cotton and spices and perfumes and opiates and all kinds of different things. And so it was a target of not just the British, but it was a target of up to 5 different European countries. If you go back to the 16th and late 17th centuries, there were 5 major European powers that had ports there. Obviously, the British get into it a little bit later, the French, First, it was the Portuguese, and then it was the Dutch that had footholds into India, and then later the Germans actually get a little piece of the pie. And so there's a lot of interest in India, and among the most successful was, of course, the British East India Company. And the British East India Company, if you recall from December, was one of those joint stock trading companies, basically a commercial organization. It was first charted in the year 1600 to profit from trade with the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. And so the British East India Company was not just involved in India, but also in other parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia as well. And they were very concerned, or very focused in their trade with, as I said, textiles and spices, spices, especially in South India. And that's where they had won trading concessions with the Mughal Empire, if you remember Akbar the Great in that time period, back in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so there were a lot of deals being done. There were a lot of, um, you know, trading rights and privileges that were being granted by the Mughal state to these European powers. And as I said, over time, um, because of these agreements, the Europeans start using the leverage, and they start reinforcing their trading positions, which gives them a more of a strategic hold in certain parts of the subcontinent. So under the Mughal Empire, if you think back to the Islamic gunpowder empires, India was developed, it was sophisticated, it had a strong military, the wealth and the population, rivaled that of Europe. It was a very advanced society and state and civilization. But with the collapse of the Mughal rule in the 18th century, all empires eventually collapse. That led to kind of the rise of a bunch of different Indian princely states or confederations. One of the most famous was the Maratha. That's how you pronounce that there in the yellow. The Maratha Confederation, which was primarily a Hindu dominant society or sub civilization. Remember, the Mughals were, of course, Muslim, and so there was that tension, that religious tension in India, and there was a weakening Mughal um, empire, and so there was this, nature abhors a vacuum. There was this conflict, especially after uh, the emperor that succeeds Akbar basically goes in, he gets rid of the jizya, or I'm sorry, reinstates the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. He goes and invades different parts of the Maratha territories, and so that leads to a conflict. And that, of course, further weakens the Mughals. They're spending a lot more resources and energy and money and wealth and blood and treasure fighting these wars. And so by the 1700s, they're basically on the decline. They weren't able to basically control India as they had been in previous centuries of their reign, and so with no unifying power, that put India in a very precarious situation where Europeans were able to take control and come in and basically start making individual deals and treaties with these individual princely states and these different confederations. And so, yeah, Aurangzeb was the emperor that invaded Maratha territory that led to that conflict. So this is a very famous. I already showed the slide, but this very famous painting of Sir Robert Clive in the mid, 18th century, just a few years before the American Revolution, and he's making a deal with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. And basically, because of the Mughals weakening and not being able to exert influence and control over all of India, they start basically tax farming out or giving tax farming contracts, which basically means that they gave the authority of the British to collect taxes in certain regions in Bengal and northwest India and along the Bay of Bengal coastal regions, so that they could, you know, at least get some revenue. And then, of course, the British got a little piece of it for their efforts. And then they also got to control trade rights and trade privileges in these territories as well. And so basically, what the British become to the Mughals is this kind of subsidiary government within the state that is given the power to tax certain areas of India and control it and suppress rebellions from these individual rulers, etc. So that's kind of how the British get a little foothold. They start off in the Bengal region. Now, over time, what we're going to see, let's see, here you go, is that, as I said, as the power of the Mughal emperor, which is let's see if I can bring my little pointer in, which is basically up here in northwest India, as it begins to weaken even further, the British don't see any point in making deals with the Mughal state, and so what they end up doing is they start making treaties and agreements with these individual rulers. If they were Hindu rulers, they were called Rajas, and if they were Muslim rulers, they were Nawabs. And so these guys, let me see if I go back to the picture. These guys, well, that would have been the Mughal emperor, but these guys, these Nawabs and these Rajas, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of different, India is a very, very large, it's not its own continent. They call it the subcontinent. But it's a very, very large area with a lot of diverse different states and peoples and languages and cultures. It's not everyone speaks the same language or has the same religion or has the same government or rule. And so the British recognize that, and so they start making these little deals with all these different princes, right? There it is. India contained more than 600. Imagine making deals with 600 different kingdoms with their own rulers. That's essentially what was happening in India. And that was, by the way, that was typical of it. Go all the way back in Indian history. It's very rare that it was ever unified under one large empire, right? Because of the diversity of its terrain and its geography. It's very difficult. It's on a north south axis, as you can kind of see here, and so it's very difficult in terms of the climate and geography. There are deserts and mountains and plateaus, and it's very difficult to unify, is the point. And so the East India Company, this joint stock company, is able to um, use that diversity or use that lack of unity to its advantage. And yeah, here would be a better picture. This is the British making a deal with, I guess this would have been a Raja. It looks like they're wearing traditional Hindu attire here, and they're making deals. And eventually, what's going to happen? These princes, they're like, okay, you can come and you can trade, you can have exclusive trading rights here in our territory, but we're still the ones in power. Well, yes and no. The British East India Company also supported its exports. They built what were called factories, not industrial revolution type factories, but these basically holding centers of goods where they would store them and wait for the ships to arrive, and then they would unload them on the docks and load them onto the ships, and then eventually they would bring in what were called company men or military rulers to basically protect their factories. And so they actually even hired native indigenous peoples to work for them, and this took even more authority away from the Rajas and the Rajputs and the Nawabs. They basically like hire native Indians to work for the company, and it was a very lucrative job. It gave a solid, respectable, dependable employment to some of these peoples that were, poor farmers or whatever. And so there was an incentive to get a regular pay from the India Company, and they were called Sepoys. These indigenous soldiers were called Sepoy soldiers, and so they were, or sometimes referred to as company men. But they, of course, were not viewed as seen as equal to the British. The British, over the years, they kind of looked down and on these sepoys. They refer to them as kind of second class citizens. And, the sepoys eventually get resentful, and they, say, hey, this is our country. You're just visitors here. Why are you treating us this way? So there was eventually some backlash and unrest that developed as a result of the Sepoy engagement or the Sepoy dynamic with the East India companies that were controlling trade. And one of the things that kind of sparks the unrest is that the Sepoy soldiers, the company men, had to start using this new Enfield rifle, which had this musket. It was basically a musket where you would take this cartridge that was filled with gunpowder. Here's a picture of what a cartridge looked like, and you would basically put the cartridge in your mouth and tear open the paper, and the paper was greased with animal fats to prevent it from cracking and getting dry and brittle and cracking. And inside it is gunpowder, so you didn't want the paper to become too dry or brittle and crack. Otherwise, the gunpowder would leak out. And of course, this was something that culturally the British didn't think twice about. But if you're an Indian Hindu, or if you're an Indian Muslim, and you're putting things in your mouth that are greased with animal fat, that can be culturally offensive. For example, the Hindus took great offense to, they believed cows were sacred. They didn't want to have, they didn't eat cows. Cows today, you can see them roaming the streets of India. They're very sacred animals. And Muslims believe that swine or pigs are unfit to be consumed, or they're not unclean animals. And so that was something that the British, they didn't, well, okay, whatever, you're in the service of the company. You don't get it. You're either going to be with us or against us. And they didn't really have a lot of sympathy to those cultural concerns. And that was kind of really the spark that ignites this big revolt, essentially, or mutiny in 1857. You've got all of these different Sepoy regiments and platoons, and they basically it starts with this great mutiny in 1857, and then it starts to spread across all of India. So there's this resistance or rebellion against the British in India. And who do they think they are coming in here? I won't make you watch that. It's a little bit long. And so this is pretty famous. This is a very famous period of history. It's called the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. And there were British living in India at the time. They were targets, of course, of the revolt, anyone that was European. And then, of course, the British, they reinforced, the East India Companies reinforced with the British Navy and the British military that was very, very powerful by the 19th century, arguably the most powerful military in the world. But this was a, prolonged, year-long guerrilla type war. It resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths on both sides, and it really marked a turning point in the British Indian relationship, or the relationship, the perception or perspective that the British had on India. That wasn't just going to be this peaceful, trading partner with all these different rajas and Nawabs. It's going to be something that's going to be a concern now. And there's a disruption in the supply and disruption in the trade of goods. And so the British, had to suppress that, they felt, and had to take a more direct control. So very important, the Sepoy Mutiny, also sometimes known as the revolt, Sepoy Revolt, or just the Mutiny of 1857. And a lot of historians, this is 90 years before Gandhi achieves Indian independence from the British in the 20th century. But some historians believe this was the first attempt at decolonization, or the Indian revolt against the British. So yeah, our good friend Karl Marx from last period, he actually wrote about, I think I have a excerpt of his letter. He wrote he was a journalist, he was a lawyer. He writes about, this is 10 years after the Communist Manifesto. He writes a little bit about the Indian revolt. And so yeah, this was sensationalized in Europe. It was written about in the British papers, and so they wanted to basically assert their control over India after that. Yeah, here is his. Look and see if you see any. This is Karl Marx's little perspective on the Sepoy Mutiny that he wrote in the newspaper. Look if you see any of his ideas reflected in letter. He's talking about the exploitation of classes and crimes and cruelties. He's basically taking the side of the Indians, right? The British have seized their territories and caste antagonisms. He doesn't call it class antagonisms, but caste because of the Indian. And it's basically this, you know, revolt against those with power and wealth against those who, he's putting everything in economic terms, with markets and starving industries. And so he's very sympathetic to the Indians because he kind of sees them as the proletariat, right? Now, eventually, the British are successful in quelling or quashing the rebellion, their overwhelming military force, and their advancements in weaponry, etc. Basically, put down this revolt, and they want to basically make an example of the ringleaders, and they don't want this to ever happen again. And so, first of all, they basically overthrow the last Mughal emperor, and he is tried for treason and exiled from his own country by the British. And then what they do is they start rounding up all of these Sepoy, uh, former company men, company soldiers, or these leaders, these regional leaders of the revolt, and they want to make an example of them. And so what they do is they round them all up and they have these series of public executions. And the way that they do it is very kind of grim. What they did was they executed them in the fashion of, I don't know if you guys have heard of this, blowing from a gun, which is a method of execution where the victim is essentially strapped on to the business end of a cannon, as you can see here, and then they fire the cannon. And so it's a very gruesome type of execution. This is even worse than death by firing squad or hanging or even electric chair or anything. And the reason that they did this was because it killed them twice, right? So, first of all, they would die physically, and as it says here from an eyewitness, the gun is fired, the head went up, the straight up in the air, 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly to the left and the right. And it basically decimates their body, but they also die a second death because their remains were so destroyed that there couldn't be any proper burial or funeral. And that was, well, a necessary funeral rite from the perspective of Muslims and Hindus. And so their punishment essentially was extended beyond death. And that was used in a way to send a warning that if you try this again, if anyone ever else gets the idea in the future to rise up against the power of the British Empire, that this is what will happen to you. You'll die not only in this world, you'll die in the afterlife. So kind of gruesome, but a little bit effective. Now, the point of the Great Mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, was that, as I said, it marked a huge turning point in the British-Indian relations. And after this mutiny and after this kind of rebellion, this year-long rebellion, the monarchy under Queen Victoria here, this is Queen Victoria, the 19th century is generally known as the Victorian period. Um, she basically orders the East India Company dissolved. It was given a grant from the monarch in the first place, a charter to trade. She revokes that, abolishes the East India Company, and says from now on, to continue the flow of goods coming out of India, we will take a more direct control over India because it is our most valued colony, our most prized possession at this point, and we need to protect it at all costs. And so this is the kind of the turning point where India becomes not an indirect colony, but it begins to be ruled directly by the British. They establish cantonments and garrisons and governors and magistrates, and they basically take over the administration and the governance of India. And so this is sometimes called the British Raj, which is a Hindi word for king, I believe, or reign. And so the British reign, if you will, over India begins after the Great Mutiny. And so Queen Elizabeth, I'm sorry, not Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria is then given the additional title Empress of India in addition to the United Kingdom. And so she's Basically, Queen of the UK, Great Britain, Ireland, and India from 1837 until 1901. So almost the entirety of that 19th century, which was, relatively after the Napoleonic era, relatively peaceful time period. Some people call it the Pax Britannica. There was the Crimean War and a couple of other regional conflicts, but for the most part, there's not a lot of violence or war that had existed, from the age of religious wars to the, wars of King Louis and all the European conflicts, the 7 Years' War, all the way up until the Napoleonic era. So the Victorian period is kind of marked by a little bit of peace. And here she is having looks like picnic or lunch with her family, perhaps being served and waited upon by Indians, of course. And so, yeah, that's how India becomes the jewel of the crown. Now, next period, we will talk a little bit about the Europeans' attraction to Africa and why Africa was so important. But I did want to give you a little bit of idea about how India becomes a part of really the British Empire. Thanks so much. I'll see you guys soon.